Another thing I missed while I was off falling apart was the whole Martha's Vineyard migrant thing. Here's the TLDR. In September of 2022, Florida Governor Ron Desantis flew 50 immigrants, mostly refugees from Venezuela, to Martha's Vineyard. Martha's Vineyard, an island off the coast of Massachusetts, is one of the wealthiest locations in the entire United States. A reasonably isolated spot where movie stars, politicians, and billionaires keep vacation homes that sit empty for most of the year. It's a scenic, beautiful location with lots of old buildings and history. It's also one of the most deeply blue voting locations in the entire country, on par with places like New York and California. DeSantis' decision to transport the 50 immigrants to Martha's Vineyard is best understood in the context of a wider program by Texas Governor Greg Abbott doing something very similar, busing people arriving in his state from other countries to places like LA, New York City, and Washington, D.C. The Texas state government has transported over 10,000 immigrants out of the red state to these predominantly blue areas since the beginning of 2022. A lot of people on the broader left are complaining about this state of affairs. Your rank-and-file internet leftoids are screeching at everyone on the right, calling them racist and fascist for this, but they do that for everything. Establishment Democrat politicians are claiming that DeSantis and Abbott are engaging in human trafficking by moving the migrants from red states to blue states. Documentary filmmaker Ken Burns went on CNN to compare the move to the Holocaust, since his upcoming documentary is partially about the Holocaust, saying, "It's the abstraction of human life. This is coming straight out of the authoritarian playbook. This is what's so disturbing about DeSantis, to use human beings, to weaponize human beings for political purpose." And the incredibly rich people of Martha's Vineyard were very quick to say that they just can't help the migrants. There's no room here.
We have, at some point in time, they have to move from here to somewhere else, right? We don't have the services to take care of 50 immigrants, and we certainly don't have housing. We're in a housing crisis as we are on this island, and so we can't house everyone here that lives here and works here. We don't have housing for 50 more people.
A quick peek on local Martha's Vineyard Facebook groups will show these people ripping each other apart for not wanting to give up their vacant rental properties and summer homes for the migrants to live in, which is just hilarious to watch. After all, diversity is our strength, isn't it? Why not make Martha's Vineyard more diverse? Places like Martha's Vineyard voted for and support things like illegal immigration, open borders policies, and sanctuary states and cities. Why should their communities not be the sanctuary? Why should they not be the ones to support the consequences of their votes? The red states overwhelmingly voted against these policies, so it makes sense that they transfer these people to the states that actually want them. What's the issue here? Well, seeing as I'm a few weeks late on the story, some further info has come out that I assume right-leaning YouTubers and pundits probably haven't talked about, either because it goes against their biases or because the news cycle has moved on. One good thing about being slow is I can actually get the whole picture. Firstly, while it's really funny to watch the hyper-rich of Martha's Vineyard rip each other apart, because they can't just virtue signal anymore, they're actually being called to do something in reality. Some of them actually did step up. A lot of them failed to put their money where their mouth is, and revealed themselves to be the racists we always knew them to be, which is why the memes that came out of this were so hilarious. But some of them actually did it. When the 50 migrants arrived at Martha's Vineyard, part of the community actually turned a local community center into a shelter, providing beds and food. They may not have the infrastructure to let them live on the island in perpetuity, and their reaction was pretty funny when they finally left, but it's not like they were instantly abandoned the second they stepped off the plane. Secondly, it turns out that, at least in the case of the specific 50 migrants that DeSantis sent to Migrants Vineyard, they were lied to. They were enticed to get on the plane by Florida officials, telling them they were actually headed to Boston to get work papers. Judd Legum, a freelance journalist, got a hold of the brochures that were handed out by the officials to the 50 migrants. The brochures claim to be on behalf of the state of Massachusetts, and they offer benefits like 8 months of cash payments, food, job training, and housing to new refugees. The programs listed on the brochure are real in Massachusetts, but the pamphlet wasn't made by anybody from that state. It was made by the state of Florida. To me, this is scummy. Okay, your state doesn't want to deal with the effects of an open borders policy you didn't vote for. I understand that part. You want to send the migrants to locations who voted for them. Got it. You entice people with the benefits of those other locations. Even that's okay. But to tell them, hey, you're going to Boston to get all this shit in the brochure, and instead send them to Martha's Vineyard for a political stunt, that's actually pretty shitty. And DeSantis knew that he had to basically pull the old switcheroo on this one, which is why he deliberately lied about migrants on other planes leaving Florida to the press. Though it is reasonable to send migrants from states who don't want them and didn't vote for them to states that do and did, that's not quite what DeSantis is doing here. He's trying to keep his stunt in the news cycle for one more round in order to raise his own profile. It's not about sending migrants to sanctuary cities or states. If so, they would have been sent to Boston as promised. Instead, it's about sticking it to the Democratic wealthy elite, which is fine, but it's using migrants as a pawn to do it while lying to them, which isn't fine. Even if it turns out that these people are 100% illegal immigrants, there's no legitimate reason for asylum status or anything like that, then what you should do is deport them, not ship them around the country to raise your electability with your base. They're still people, they've still got rights. They may not have the right to stay in your country, but that doesn't mean that you can do with them what you will. All that being said, it's not like Republicans are uniquely guilty for shipping around new arrivals for political gain. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot did the same thing a week before this story broke. Abbott sent 150 migrants to Chicago, since Chicago is a sanctuary city. And Lightfoot, a Democrat, packed them up and sent them to the nearby Republican voting town of Burr Ridge, specifically to a hotel that 1 year ago partnered with churches and charitable organizations to temporarily house Afghani refugees after the fall of the Afghan government. But that was a one-time deal, specific to that event, which you could argue that the Americans had a moral obligation to help out with, considering that they caused the Afghanistan situation in the first place. But ultimately, it's a hotel, not a refugee facility. All of this is justified by what the Republicans have come to call the Biden administration's ghost flights. The term ghost flight refers to what Republicans call secret flights that carry migrants from the border to communities across the country. Up until the start of 2022, ghost flight actually referred to planes that flew around with little or no passengers to preserve an airline's runway spot at a destination airport, where it would have cost them more to not fly the plane and lose the spot to their competition than it would to just fly an empty plane. But in this context, it refers to something different, referring to the Biden administration secretly packing migrants onto planes at the border under the cover of darkness and shipping them off to the American interior. At least one video secretly shot by former House Rep Lou Barletta at an airport in Pennsylvania seemed to show the nighttime journey of a bunch of newly arrived migrants. But the Republican interpretation of these events seems to be wrong. The flights aren't secret. The law authorizing them was first signed in 2000 by Bill Clinton as the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act, and was renewed in 2003, 2006, and 2008 by George Bush. It lapsed in 2011, but Obama brought it back in 2013 as an amendment to the Violence Against Women Act, which passed. The amendment lapsed in 2017, and Trump reauthorized it, this time as its own bill again, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2017. By the way, that Violence Against Women Act, which the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was temporarily stapled onto by Obama in 2013, it lapsed as a result of the 2018 government shutdown, but had an attempted revival in April of 2019. However, it was Senate Democrats, desperate to not give Trump any sort of a win, who refused to get on board with reauthorizing it. Biden eventually signed it back into law in March of 2022. I don't know if Biden's 2022 reauthorizing also revived the stapled version of the Trafficking Act, considering that it became its own thing again back in 2018, but if it did, it was likely up for renewal anyway. The point is, though, the federal government hasn't been secretly flying migrants around the country to settle all over the place. It's been openly doing it, and has been on and off for over 20 years. You can argue that practice should be stopped, but to imply it's being done in secret, away from any sort of oversight, and hidden from the people just isn't true. That kind of rhetoric only serves to prop up the narrative that it's the Republican heroes who have uncovered the truth they're trying to hide, when in actuality it's not a secret, it's normal. You can argue it shouldn't be normal, and maybe it shouldn't be, but you haven't discovered a conspiracy here, guys. The actual conversation, though, is that the Biden administration, and Trump, and Obama, and Bush, and Clinton, under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, have done for years what Abbott and Desantis are doing now. Setting aside Desantis lying to the migrants to get them on board the Martha's Vineyard plane, and that's a pretty big thing to set aside, but let's roll with it. Setting that aside, what is the difference? Nobody seems to have a coherent answer to that question, but the Washington Post did attempt to give one. The difference between Desantis' migrant flights and the Biden administration's. Just as criticisms of the Biden administration's supposed ghost flights have long been overblown, the comparison between the two situations mismatches in some key ways. The whataboutism drumbeat has picked up in recent days. You know, just saying that's whataboutism isn't actually a reply. When you bring up whataboutism, you're noticing that the topic has suddenly shifted from Desantis' migrant flights to Biden's, which doesn't excuse DeSantis, true, but it also doesn't excuse Biden. We're talking about A right now, not B, is a true statement, but it serves to excuse neither A nor B. The criticisms often skirt over to the fact that these flights carry children, and that's important. In fact, the government, by law, cannot hold unaccompanied minors in border facilities for more than 72 hours, and they must be cared for while they are transported to relatives, sponsors, or shelters. Fair enough. We should probably ask why there are so many unaccompanied minors coming across the American border. Maybe there's something wrong with how the border is currently being handled, but asking questions in 2022 is racist. Another key distinction. It is indeed the federal government that is charged with enforcing immigration law. Also true, but as far as I know, DeSantis and Abbott aren't enforcing immigration law. They're not deciding who stays or goes. They're sending people who stay to sanctuary cities and states. The buses and planes used by Republican governors, by contrast, convey people of all ages, and they are asylum seekers. The program is set up for people who have been processed by federal immigration officials and are awaiting their dates in court. DeSantis and Abbott have said that these migrants signed waivers, meaning their transportation was elective rather than required by law. And if that's all it turns out to be, there's likely to be no legal trouble. Some migrants have said they were grateful to be transported to more welcoming places, but Democrats, immigrant advocates, and some of the migrants themselves have suggested the migrants might have been misled into participating. That's the stated reason most are objecting to the practice. And here we go, the only real criticism that doesn't just fall back on, well, this is just how the system is. Abbott and DeSantis claim that the migrants have consented to being moved around, and that's pretty believable. If you tell a migrant, listen, Texas and Florida won't help you, but California and New York will, do you want to go there? They're probably going to say yes. The article even says if that's the case, there's actually no reasonable objection to the practice. The issue is, some people claim it's happened without their consent, and you can make a pretty strong argument that for the Martha's Vineyard stunt, the act of deliberately lying about where the plane was going constitutes a lack of consent. At that point, it probably does become a form of human trafficking. The Martha's Vineyard migrants came from Texas originally. I think it was the feds that shipped them to Florida. Then it was Florida that shipped them to Martha's Vineyard while telling them they were going to Boston. The sheriff of their point of origin, from Bexar County, Texas, submitted certification to have the migrants apply for U visas, which are a special type of visa for the victims of a crime to remain in the United States to ensure that when the time comes, they are available to police or the court system as witnesses. The sheriff has said, based on the claims of migrants being transported from Bexar County under false pretenses, we are investigating this case as possible unlawful restraint. There's two levels of malicious intent here. The first one is how the Democratic establishment views migrants in the first place. They want the country to take them in, and if you disagree with them, you're a racist. But they don't want to be the ones who actually have to care for them. They want you to do that. They want to appear virtuous by opening the borders and saying everyone's welcome. But when it comes to footing that bill, they're not going to do it themselves. They're going to point at Middle America. Migrants are welcome, just not in the rich, affluent Democratic neighborhoods where senators and philanthropists live. You're going to be the one who houses and clothes these people, because it makes them feel like they're doing the right thing. This attitude is best spelled out by the Delusional Reason article, advocating that Republicans should take in immigrants to stick it to Biden's broken border policies. Like, fucking what? The second level, though, is that among the completely reasonable responses from the right, which basically amount to, no, fuck you, take responsibility for your own decisions, Democrats, where Abbott and Desantis have been moving migrants to neighborhoods who actually voted for them. During that reasonable response, it seems like Desantis may have actually fucked up. It's actually quite bad if the Martha's Vineyard migrants were sent there under false pretenses. That likely is some kind of trafficking or kidnapping or unlawful restraint or whatever the fuck, and the shadow of that terrible move is going to loom over the whole project. The conversation has shifted away from Texas didn't vote for these migrants, so we're sending them to New York who did vote for them, which is entirely reasonable, to Desantis kidnapped migrants and shipped them away for a political stunt, which is entirely awful. If you're saying in your head right now, Dev, why are you focusing on this one tiny bad action by Desantis when it's the Democrats that are the problem? They shouldn't be doing any of this. Everything they've been doing is wrong. You haven't been listening to me. If you're going up against the establishment, you have to be squeaky clean. I've said in multiple videos now, if you are better than them, you have to behave better than them. There's a reason these migrant transports have been happening since January without a peep from anyone, but only turned into a viral story in September. It's because the Republicans were actually doing everything properly and above board, and there was no reasonable objection against it until DeSantis fucked up.